August 15, 1945. Across a nation reduced to ruins, millions of people gathered around fragile radios. The air was heavy with smoke, defeat, and disbelief. And then, a voice. Soft, distant, almost divine. The Emperor of Japan was speaking directly to his people for the first time in history. Most could not understand his formal, archaic language. But they understood the tone. The war was over. It was called the Gyokuon-hōsō, the dual voice broadcast. And behind that calm, trembling voice lay chaos, betrayal, and blood. Because Japan's final message to the world almost never reached it. By the summer of 1945, Japan was dying. The once mighty empire that had conquered half of Asia stood on the edge of total collapse. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya had become fields of ash. The American firebombing raids had consumed more lives than even the atomic bombs that would follow. On August 6, Hiroshima vanished in a blinding light. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Between them, 200,000 souls were gone. Yet, even before the atomic bombs, Japan's leaders already knew the war was lost. The navy lay shattered at the bottom of the Pacific. The skies belonged entirely to American bombers. The army bled out across China, Burma, and countless Pacific islands. But the idea of surrender was unthinkable. The Bushido Code, honor until death, had been drilled into generations. Surrender meant shame. Surrender meant the death of the soul of Japan. Inside the Imperial Palace, however, reality was inescapable. The question was no longer if Japan would surrender, but how. How to end the war without losing the emperor, the living embodiment of the nation itself. By early August, pressure from both inside and outside the government reached a breaking point. The Americans demanded unconditional surrender. The army wanted to fight to the last man. Civilians starved in the streets. The once unified empire now fractured between despair and denial. On August 9, 6 men gathered in the underground chambers of the Imperial Palace. It was the Supreme War Council, Japan's highest decision-making body. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo begged for peace. War Minister Korechika Anami refused to accept defeat. He believed dying with honor was better than living in shame. For hours, their voices echoed through the bunker, pleading, arguing, breaking. Then, without warning, new reports arrived. The Soviet Union, once a neutral observer, had declared war on Japan. Over 1 million Soviet troops invaded Manchuria, crushing Japan's last defensive hopes in the north. The illusion of any possible victory vanished overnight. Even the most loyal generals saw the truth. Japan stood alone, encircled by enemies, out of weapons, out of time. But no one dared speak directly against the emperor. It was then, for the first time, that Emperor Hirohito broke the centuries-old silence of divine neutrality. He told them, in calm, deliberate words, "We must endure the unendurable." That night, Japan's fate was sealed, not by generals, not by foreign powers, but by the emperor himself. He would end the war. But the act of surrender would become one of the most dangerous moments in Japan's modern history. As preparations for the emperor's surrender message began, resistance brewed within the military. To many officers, surrender was treason. The idea that the emperor would speak words of defeat was unthinkable. And so, a plan was born, to prevent that broadcast from ever being heard. In the shadows of the Imperial Palace, a group of young army officers began plotting. Led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, they believed that saving Japan meant stopping the emperor's surrender. They convinced themselves that Hirohito was being manipulated by traitors and weak politicians. To them, true loyalty meant protecting the divine will, even against the emperor himself. On the night of August 14, Tokyo was still smoldering from air raids. The city's skeleton burned in the distance. Within the imperial compound, officials hurried through narrow corridors, carrying something sacred, 2 lacquer record discs, each containing the emperor's voice. The recording had been made in secret. Deep inside the palace, technicians set up a small microphone and recording machine. Few were allowed to enter. The emperor read his speech twice, in his formal court language, his voice trembling but composed. Those who witnessed it said that time seemed to stop. That the divine had spoken like a man for the first time. After the recording, the discs were sealed inside protective cases. They were to be broadcast the next day, at noon. But the conspirators had already begun their move. As midnight approached, Hatanaka's men surrounded the palace. They cut phone lines, seized the gates, and took key officials hostage. They demanded to know where the recording was kept. Inside the palace, chaos erupted, whispers, gunfire, footsteps in the dark. The emperor's aides, realizing what was happening, acted quickly. They hid the recording inside a simple laundry basket, disguising it among piles of linen. Then they locked it inside a secret vault within the palace. If the rebels found it, Japan's surrender, and the emperor's message, would be lost forever. As dawn neared, Tokyo descended into confusion. Soldiers pointed rifles at one another in the courtyard of the imperial grounds. The coup leaders issued forged orders, claiming to act in the emperor's name. But the senior commanders hesitated. They could not believe their emperor truly wanted the war to continue. By sunrise, the rebellion collapsed. The palace remained under imperial control. Hatanaka, realizing his failure, rode through the streets of Tokyo distributing leaflets, pleading for soldiers to continue fighting. Then, just before noon, he took his own life. In his pocket, they found a note. "I have nothing to regret now that the emperor's will is done." That same noon, every radio across Japan came alive. Static. It was the voice of Emperor Hirohito. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he spoke in formal, distant terms of the war situation developing not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He spoke of the enemy's new and most cruel bomb. He urged his people to bear the unbearable and to preserve world peace for all generations. Across the empire, from the ruins of Tokyo to the jungles of Burma, millions listened in silence. Some wept in disbelief. Others bowed in grief. For the first time, they heard the human voice of a man they had been taught was divine. To a nation raised to die for the emperor, hearing him ask them to live was beyond comprehension. It was not only the end of the war, it was the end of an era, the death of a belief. In villages, temples, and bunkers, radios crackled as the message spread. Japanese soldiers scattered across Asia heard the news days later. Some refused to believe it, assuming it was enemy propaganda. Others broke down in tears, realizing that everything they had fought for was over. Within hours, flags were lowered. Weapons were surrendered. And Japan, an empire built on conquest and devotion, collapsed into silence. The emperor remained on the throne, but everything had changed. He was no longer a god, only a man. His divine authority had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet, burdened humanity. He lived the rest of his life not as a ruler of conquest, but as a symbol of peace and reflection. In the days following the broadcast, the recording was carefully preserved. The lacquer discs, fragile, scratched, and aged, became one of the most important artifacts of the 20th century. They held the voice that ended the deadliest conflict in human history. A voice that had survived bombs, rebellion, and betrayal. The Japanese people would later call that day Shusen no Hai, the day the war ended. But it was more than just the end of fighting. It marked the rebirth of a nation. The moment when myth gave way to reality. In the rubble of Tokyo, life began to return. Children played among the ruins. Trains started running again. Factories rebuilt from scrap metal. The same cities that had burned to the ground began to hum with energy once more. The emperor's words, once hidden and feared, echoed through history, not as a command, but as a confession. A recognition that even divine power could not escape the truth of war. He had asked his people to endure, not to conquer. To live, not to die. It was the beginning of a long and painful journey toward peace. For Hirohito himself, peace came at a cost. He was questioned by the Allied occupation, but never tried for war crimes. Many believed that his survival was necessary to keep Japan stable during reconstruction. He became a silent figurehead, present, yet distant. The man who had once been a god became a symbol of humility, rebuilding, and restraint. Decades later, historians would debate his responsibility. Was he the architect of Japan's aggression, or its final savior? The truth remains complex, buried beneath layers of loyalty, myth, and silence. But one fact endures: without his decision to surrender, the war might have continued for months, perhaps years, at the cost of millions more lives. That quiet broadcast saved a nation from extinction. Today, the original recording of the Gyokuon-hōsō survives in Japan's National Archives. It is a relic of sound, crackling, fragile, haunting. Every word carries the weight of a fallen empire. Every pause holds the breath of a nation that listened in disbelief. When played today, the static still hums through the decades, followed by that trembling voice, measured, distant, human. It is more than just history. It is the moment when Japan's gods became men. And history itself drew its final breath before peace.